Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're going back in time, kind of way back to 1953, to explore this landmark study on female sexuality, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female by Alfred Kinsey.
Oh, yeah, Kinsey.
This book really shook things up back then,
It did.
and we're going to see how some of those findings hold up today.
It's hard to overstate just how revolutionary this research was. I mean, Kinsey and his team interviewed thousands of women.
Wow.
They used everything from interviews and diaries to even personal artwork.
Really? Artwork?
Yeah, to try to get the complete picture of what women's sexual experiences were really like.
Mm.
And this is at a time when, these conversations weren't really happening. They were taboo.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what kind of picture did Kinsey paint? Did his findings match up with, the prevailing norms of the time?
Well, not exactly. And that's what made this research so important. For instance, one of the things that raised eyebrows was that 53% of the women in the study said they only had one sexual partner before marriage. Now, you might think, well, that sounds pretty conservative.
Yeah.
But remember, this was the 1950s.
Right.
The expectation was that, nice girls didn't
Didn't do that.
didn't engage in premarital sex at all.
Wow, that is such a fascinating contrast. Between societal expectations and what people were actually doing.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what else did Kinsey uncover that challenged those assumptions?
Well, let's talk about the female orgasm, for example.
Okay.
There was this idea that women were, slower to climax than men.
Oh, yeah.
But Kinsey's research kind of turned that idea on its head. His findings actually suggested that women reach orgasm much faster through masturbation than intercourse.
Now, that's interesting. I wonder if that points to a difference in the types of stimulation that women respond to.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's something that researchers are still exploring today. Kinsey's findings definitely opened up that conversation. And speaking of assumptions, remember all those stereotypes about women not being visually stimulated?
Oh, yeah, that men are all about what they see, while women are more about, romance and ambiance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Kinsey's data kind of challenged that as well. Most of the women that he interviewed were not aroused by visual depictions of sex, which, really highlights just how much the mind plays a role in female sexual response.
Yeah.
It's not just about the physical,
Right.
but also about, our individual experiences, thoughts, and emotions.
It's like those cheesy romance novels that describe a man's gaze making a woman weak in the knees.
Right.
Maybe that's more fiction than reality.
Yeah.
So we've got these cultural assumptions about women's sexuality being challenged by Kinsey's findings on premarital sex and visual stimulation.
Uh-huh.
But what about the biological side of things? Hormones are supposed to be a big driver of sex drive, right?
Right. And Kinsey's team definitely explored that connection. But what they found challenged that simple hormones equals sex drive equation. They discovered that even castration didn't eliminate sexual desire in adult women.
Wow, that's a powerful finding. It really dismantles that idea that female sexuality can be boiled down to simple biological explanations.
It does. And it leads us to one of the most important takeaways from Kinsey's work. Female sexuality is a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors.
So it's not just about our bodies,
Right.
but also about our minds and our social environments. I'm starting to see why this book was considered so groundbreaking. It must have really started to shift the conversation around female sexuality.
Absolutely. And speaking of shifting conversations, let's delve into one area where Kinsey's findings were particularly shocking at the time: masturbation.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. What did Kinsey discover about how women actually experienced masturbation? Because back then it was such a taboo subject.
You're right. Masturbation was viewed as something shameful, even unhealthy. But Kinsey's research revealed that it was much more common among women than anyone had previously thought. And even more surprising, many of the women in the study saw it as a positive and healthy experience.
So not some dark secret, but actually a normal part of many women's lives. I bet that was a revelation back then.
It really was. The research showed that many women found masturbation pleasurable and even a necessary outlet for their sexuality. Remember, this was a time when open discussion about female pleasure was pretty much non-existent.
Yeah.
So Kinsey's work not only revealed how widespread this behavior was, but it also started to challenge the negative stigma surrounding it.
That's incredible. He was really paving the way for women to embrace their sexuality and find pleasure on their own terms.
He was. And speaking of finding pleasure on their own terms, Kinsey's research also delved into the techniques women use for masturbation.
Okay.
And you might be surprised by the variety.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
The most common technique was direct genital stimulation. But the study also revealed that some women use thigh pressure, muscular tension, or even other methods to achieve orgasm.
Hmm.
It really emphasizes the individual nature of sexual experience.
Right, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to pleasure.
Right.
And I bet this research really challenged the idea that there was only one right way for women to experience their sexuality.
Exactly. Kinsey's work showed that female sexuality was far more diverse and nuanced than anyone had previously imagined. And that diversity extended to the realm of fantasy as well.
Oh, tell me about that. Did the study find that women fantasize during masturbation?
They did. But here's where it gets really interesting. While 72% of men in the study reported almost always fantasizing during masturbation, only 50% of women said the same.
So men are more likely to rely on fantasy for arousal. What do you think might be some reasons behind that difference?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how men and women might experience sexual arousal differently. It could be related to societal conditioning, biological differences, or even personal preferences. And it's something that researchers continue to explore today.
This is fascinating stuff. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about partnered sex. Kinsey's book delved into premarital sex, right? What did he find about women's experiences in that area, especially considering the social norms of the time?
Well, this is where we really see those shifting societal norms come into play. The study found that the incidence of premarital sex was significantly higher in women born after 1900 compared to those born earlier.
So it seems like each generation was becoming a bit more permissive, or maybe just more honest about their experiences.
Possibly both. It definitely suggests that attitudes towards premarital sex were evolving. However, it's still the 1950s, so premarital sex wasn't exactly celebrated. Did the study look at the social and emotional impact of those experiences on women? It did touch on that many women were caught between their desires and the societal expectations placed upon them. This often led to feelings of guilt, anxiety, and even fear.
I can only imagine the internal conflict that many women must have experienced navigating their own desires in a society that wasn't quite ready to accept them.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting area that Kinsey explored: marital sex.
Okay, so let's talk about what went on behind closed doors in the 1950s. What did Kinsey uncover about sex within marriage?
One of the most striking findings was the sheer frequency of marital sex. It was happening much more often than anyone had previously thought. Couples in their 20s were having sex 2 to 3 times a week on average.
Wow. That's a lot more action than the stereotypical image of the repressed 1950s housewife might suggest.
Right. But while couples were clearly engaging in sex regularly, the study also revealed an important gap. A significant number of wives were not reaching orgasm during marital sex.
That's heartbreaking. Why do you think that was the case? Was it a lack of knowledge or communication about female pleasure?
I think that was a major factor. Remember, this was before the sexual revolution, and many men simply didn't understand how to please their wives.
Right.
There wasn't the same level of awareness about the female body and the importance of clitoral stimulation that we have today.
So a lack of understanding and perhaps a lack of communication were contributing to a lot of women not having their needs met in the bedroom.
Yeah.
It sounds like Kinsey's work really highlighted the importance of female sexual agency and pleasure in a healthy sexual relationship.
Absolutely. And speaking of relationships, there's one final area of Kinsey's research that I think we need to address: extramarital sex.
Ooh, the taboo topic. What did Kinsey uncover about women's experiences with infidelity? It always felt like a topic shrouded in secrecy, especially back then.
Well, the research revealed that extramarital affairs were more common than one might think, even in the seemingly conservative 1950s. About 26% of the women in the study had engaged in extramarital sex by the age of 40.
26%, that's higher than I would have guessed. I guess what happens behind closed doors can be very different from what society wants us to believe. Did Kinsey's team explore why women might engage in extramarital sex?
They did, and the reasons were as varied as the women themselves. Some were seeking sexual satisfaction they weren't finding in their marriages, while others cited emotional needs or desire for novelty and excitement.
It sounds like there's no simple explanation for why people cheat. Just like with everything else we've talked about, it's complex and multifaceted.
Exactly. Human behavior, especially when it comes to sexuality, rarely fits into neat little boxes. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from Kinsey's work: embracing that complexity and moving away from simplistic judgments.
I love that. It seems like Kinsey wasn't just trying to document sexual behavior. He was trying to understand it in all its messy, complicated glory.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what makes his work so relevant even today. He paved the way for a more open and nuanced conversation about sexuality, one that acknowledges the full spectrum of human experiences.
And that's a conversation that continues to evolve even now. So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what do you think are the most important things for our listeners to remember about Kinsey's research, especially given that it was conducted over 70 years ago?
I think the key takeaway is that human sexuality is incredibly complex and influenced by a wide range of factors. Kinsey's work may have been groundbreaking, but it was also a product of its time. As we continue to explore and understand sexuality, we should approach the topic with the same open-mindedness and curiosity that Kinsey embodied, while also recognizing that our understanding will continue to evolve with each new generation.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part one of our exploration of Alfred Kinsey's sexual behavior in the human female. Join us for part two, where we'll delve into some of the specific details of his findings, from masturbation techniques to marital dynamics. And be sure to stick around for part three, where we'll tackle the criticisms and controversies that surrounded Kinsey's work, as well as his lasting legacy.
See you there. Welcome back to our deep dive into Alfred Kinsey's pioneering research on female sexuality. In the last part, we talked about how Kinsey's work really challenged a lot of the assumptions about women and sex in the 1950s.
Yeah, it was really eye-opening.
But this was just the tip of the iceberg.
That's right. We're ready to go deeper now, so let's pick up where we left off with masturbation.
Okay.
Kinsey's findings in this area were particularly groundbreaking, especially given how taboo the subject was back then.
Absolutely. One of the most fascinating details Kinsey uncovered was the sheer variety of techniques women used for masturbation.
Oh, tell me more about that. We touched on it briefly in the last part, but I'm ready for all the juicy details. What did Kinsey discover about the different approaches women took to self-pleasure?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the most common technique reported was direct genital stimulation.
Hmm.
But Kinsey also found that some women used thigh pressure, muscular tension, or even a combination of methods. This variety really speaks to the individuality of sexual experience, doesn't it?
It really does. It reinforces the idea that there's no one right way to experience pleasure. It's all about what works for you. And I think that's a message that's still so important today, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with images and messages about what's considered normal or desirable.
You're so right. Kinsey's work was all about celebrating that diversity of experience.
Yeah.
Speaking of diversity, another aspect of masturbation that Kinsey explored was the role of fantasy.
Oh, yes, fantasy. That's a whole other world of exploration. Did Kinsey's findings reveal any interesting patterns in how women used fantasy during masturbation?
They did.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier that men were more likely to report using fantasy during masturbation compared to women. But Kinsey also found that the content of those fantasies varied significantly between genders.
That makes me wonder what kind of content we're talking about here. What were some of the common themes that emerged in women's fantasies?
Well, some of the most common themes involved romantic scenarios, familiar partners, and situations where the woman felt a sense of power or control. This really challenges some of the stereotypes about female fantasies being all about submission or passivity.
That's so interesting. It speaks to the idea that women's sexual desires are just as complex and multifaceted as men's, and that they often go beyond the simplistic narratives we see portrayed in media or pop culture.
Absolutely. And this complexity extends beyond masturbation to partnered sex as well. In fact, Kinsey's research on premarital sex really highlighted how societal norms and actual behavior weren't always aligned.
Right. We talked earlier about how 53% of women in the study reported having only one sexual partner before marriage, which seems surprisingly high for the time. But I'm curious to know more about the experiences of the women who did engage in premarital sex. What did Kinsey discover about their motivations and the emotional impact of those experiences?
Well, as you can imagine, premarital sex in the 1950s was a pretty fraught topic. There was a lot of societal pressure on women to remain pure until marriage. But Kinsey's research found that many women were engaging in premarital sex despite those pressures.
So they were defying societal expectations even if it came with a cost.
Exactly. And the cost was often significant. Many of these women experienced anxiety, guilt, and fear of social repercussions. Remember, this was a time when unplanned pregnancy could have serious consequences for a woman's reputation and future prospects. So while these women were pushing boundaries, they were also doing so within a very restrictive social context.
It must have been a very difficult and often isolating experience for many women, and it really underscores how far we've come in terms of sexual freedom and acceptance.
It does, and yet even today we still see remnants of those societal pressures and double standards.
That's a really good point. Even though we've made progress, there's still work to be done to ensure that women feel empowered to make choices about their sexuality without fear of judgment or shame.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think Kinsey's research played a vital role in paving the way for that greater acceptance. But speaking of acceptance, let's shift our focus to another area where societal norms played a huge role, marital sex.
Okay, so we're stepping into the world of married couples in the 1950s. What kind of insights did Kinsey offer into the sexual dynamics within marriage?
Well, one of the most surprising findings was how often couples were actually having sex. The data showed that the average frequency for couples in their 20s was 2 to 3 times per week.
Wow, that's a lot more action than the stereotype of the prim and proper 1950s housewife might suggest.
I know, right? It really challenges the notion that the 1950s were this era of sexual repression. But here's where things get a bit more complicated. Kinsey also found a significant discrepancy between husbands and wives when it came to sexual satisfaction.
Oh, that's disheartening to hear. What kind of discrepancies are we talking about?
The study revealed that a considerable number of wives were not reaching orgasm during marital sex. And this really points to a lack of understanding and communication about female pleasure.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up communication because one of the common criticisms of Kinsey's work is that it focused too much on behavior and not enough on the emotional and psychological aspects of sex. But I think this finding about marital sex really underscores how important those emotional and relational aspects are. If couples aren't communicating effectively about their needs and desires, then it's no wonder that some partners aren't having their needs met.
That's a really insightful point.
Hmm.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Kinsey's data, even though it focuses primarily on behavior, can actually provide a springboard for deeper conversations about the emotional and relational dynamics within sexual relationships.
Exactly. Because good sex, especially within a long-term relationship, requires more than just physical compatibility. It requires trust, vulnerability, and open communication. And that's something that's often overlooked in our discussions about sexuality even today.
You're so right. We tend to focus on the mechanics of sex, but the emotional connection is just as important, if not more so. And speaking of emotional connections, let's delve into a topic that can be particularly emotionally charged, extramarital sex.
Okay, we're venturing into territory that was even more taboo in the 1950s than it is today. What did Kinsey's research reveal about the prevalence and motivations behind extramarital affairs?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, Kinsey's findings show that extramarital affairs were not as uncommon as one might think, even in that seemingly conservative era. About 26% of the women in the study had engaged in extramarital sex by the age of 40. And this really challenges the idea that infidelity is some kind of modern phenomenon.
It does. It suggests that these desires and behaviors have always been a part of the human experience, even if society has tried to suppress or shame them.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that when Kinsey's team explored the reasons behind these affairs, they found a wide range of motivations, just like we saw with premarital sex. Some women sought sexual fulfillment they weren't finding in their marriages, while others were looking for emotional connection, excitement, or a sense of validation.
So it wasn't just about a lack of sexual satisfaction, but also about a complex interplay of emotional needs and desires.
Precisely. And this really underscores the idea that infidelity is rarely a simple black and white issue. There's always a story behind the behavior, a complex web of factors that contribute to a person's choices. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we talk about infidelity even today. It's easy to jump to judgments, but the reality is often much more nuanced.
That's such an important point, and it really speaks to the heart of what Kinsey's work was all about, exploring the complexities of human sexuality without judgment or preconceived notions.
You've got it. And it's that spirit of open-mindedness and curiosity that we're going to carry with us into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll tackle the criticisms and controversies that surrounded Kinsey's work as well as his lasting legacy.
That's right. Because even though Kinsey's research was groundbreaking, it also faced a lot of backlash, especially in the conservative climate of the 1950s. So join us for part 3, where we'll delve into the critiques, the impact, and the enduring relevance of Kinsey's work on female sexuality.
See you there.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent the last 2 parts really digging into Alfred Kinsey's research on female sexuality.
Yeah, some really fascinating stuff.
I mean, we've been talking about all his findings about like masturbation and marital sex
It's pretty groundbreaking.
but as you might imagine, research this revolutionary didn't come without its share of controversy.
You're right. Kinsey's work really shook things up.
Hmm.
And not everyone was happy about it. His findings challenged a lot of deeply held beliefs and sparked a ton of debate, which continues even to this day.
I can only imagine the reaction back in the 1950s. So let's dive into those criticisms. What were some of the main points of contention that people raised about Kinsey's work?
Well, one of the most common critiques was aimed at his methodology. Critics argued that, Kinsey's sample wasn't representative of the general population. He relied heavily on volunteers, and his sample included a disproportionate number of individuals from prisons and other institutions.
So essentially, they were saying that his findings couldn't be generalized to all women.
Exactly. They questioned whether the sexual behaviors and attitudes reported by his participants, were truly reflective of the average woman's experience. And this argument about sampling bias is one that continues to be debated by researchers even today.
That makes sense. It's important to consider how the way a study is designed can influence the results. Were there other criticisms besides the sampling issue?
There were. Another common critique was that Kinsey focused too heavily on behavior and didn't pay enough attention to the emotional and psychological dimensions of sex. His critics argued that reducing sex to mere numbers and statistics missed the bigger picture of human relationships.
Okay.
Intimacy and the meaning people attach to their sexual experiences.
I see that point. It's like trying to understand love by just looking at the number of dates a couple goes on.
Right.
There's so much more to it than that.
Precisely. And this critique really speaks to the limitations of any research that focuses solely on quantifiable data. It's a reminder that human experience is complex and that sometimes numbers can't capture the full story.
Absolutely. But beyond the methodological and analytical critiques, I understand that Kinsey also faced a lot of backlash for simply bringing these topics out into the open.
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember the social climate of the time. I mean, the 1950s were a very conservative era, and Kinsey's work, with its frank discussions of female sexuality, was seen by many as a threat to traditional morality.
Yep.
He was accused of promoting promiscuity and undermining family values.
Wow, it sounds like his work really touched a nerve in society and not always in a positive way.
It did. Conservative groups and religious leaders were particularly vocal in their condemnation of Kinsey's research, arguing that, it would lead to the downfall of society.
It's amazing to think about how much power those social norms held back then. It must have taken a lot of courage for Kinsey to even publish his findings in that kind of environment.
It did. And even though he faced immense criticism and personal attacks, he remained committed to his research, believing that, open and honest conversations about sexuality were essential for individual well-being and societal progress.
Sounds like he was a true pioneer, willing to push boundaries and challenge the status quo, even when it meant facing, harsh criticism. And despite all the controversy, his work has had a profound and lasting impact on our understanding of female sexuality. What do you think are some of the most significant ways that Kinsey's research has shaped the conversation about sex and gender?
Well, for one thing, he completely shattered the silence around female sexuality. Before Kinsey, women's sexual experiences were largely ignored or dismissed, his work brought those experiences to light, giving women a voice and a platform to talk about their desires, their pleasures, and their challenges.
So he helped to shift the focus from shame and secrecy to open dialogue and exploration.
Exactly. And that shift was incredibly important for paving the way for the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And beyond, Kinsey's research challenged the double standards surrounding male and female sexuality, arguing that women were just as entitled to sexual pleasure and fulfillment as men.
Sounds like he was a key figure in challenging those traditional gender roles and expectations, not just in the bedroom, but in society as a whole.
He was. And his work helped to lay the groundwork for the movements for women's sexual liberation and reproductive rights that gained momentum in the decades that followed.
That's an incredible legacy. But even though Kinsey's research was groundbreaking, it's important to acknowledge that it was conducted over 70 years ago. Times have changed, and our understanding of sexuality has continued to evolve. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will carry with them as they navigate the complex world of sexuality today?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that, human sexuality is a vast and multifaceted landscape. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding it. Kinsey's research, while groundbreaking for its time, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So it's important to approach this topic with an open mind, recognizing that there's always more to learn and that our understanding will continue to evolve.
Exactly. And I think another important takeaway is that open and honest communication is crucial for healthy sexual relationships.
Oh,
Whether it's talking about our desires, our boundaries, or our concerns, communication is the key to creating intimacy, trust, and mutual satisfaction.
that's such an important reminder because even though we live in a more sexually open society than the one Kinsey was researching, many of us still struggle to talk openly about sex.
It's true. But I think Kinsey's work has shown us that, the more we talk about these things, the more we normalize them, and the less power, shame, and secrecy hold over us.
Beautifully said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from Kinsey's groundbreaking findings to the criticisms he faced and the lasting impact of his work. It's been a fascinating journey through the history of sexuality, and I hope our listeners have gained some new insights and perspectives along the way.
Me too. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you.
And for all of you listening, remember that the conversation about sexuality is ongoing. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep challenging those outdated norms and assumptions.
Absolutely. And remember to approach these conversations with curiosity, compassion, and an open mind.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's a wrap for our deep dive into the world of Alfred Kinsey and his research on female sexuality. Thanks for joining us.